The city had been a smear of rain and sodium light when she first let him in. Rain threaded the taxi's rear window like silver embroidery as Noah leaned forward, his jaw catching the street lamp in a way that made Emma feel as if the world had been paused on a flattering frame. He smiled, as if that alone could steady a landscape. She, who had learned to wield charm as currency, accepted the steadiness like a gift. He gave her a house. It was the kind of present that made the smallness inside her feel rearranged, sudden and untenable, and oddly right. She had been 29, recently, and ridiculously single, in a city that measured worth in invitations, in the angle of a photograph, and the house, wrapped in a cedar-smelling newness, filled the rooms that used to echo with the polite distance of other people. Friends called it a milestone. Photographers came once, for a glossy cascade of light through tall windows. Neighbors introduced themselves with names like soft instruments. Emma had learned, early and thoroughly, how the right property could alter the ledger of attention. But what surprised her inside was how much the house made her want to be still. Noah moved through that stillness as if he had always belonged to its geometry. He left no mess he could find, folded his coat with the care of someone returning a borrowed thing, and knew, without being told, how she liked her coffee. Black, cold brewed, and served in a specific chipped mug she kept from a trip with her mother. His voice fell where she wanted it to. It didn't clamber for applause. When he laughed, it sounded calibrated to the softest setting of the rooms. When he said, "I thought you might like this," and handed her a small wooden box, she opened it and found not jewelry, but a key, its head carved with a pattern like scales. The cedar in the house gathered itself around the gift and breathed. At first, the anomalies were blank spaces she could fill with generosity. Little foxholes of doubt she smoothed out with the kerosene of gratitude. He arrived late and left early on days that went unattended in conversation. He had a steadiness in sleep that made her admire him. His chest rose and fell in an even metronome. He turned the pages of books carefully and never left them open to mid-sentence. Once, when she found him in front of her bedroom mirror fixing his collar, she saw a second reflection move behind him. A trick of light, she told herself then, or fatigue making the glass betray her. Still, she catalogued everything. That was how she had survived all her life. By taking measure. Kem called it practical, which was how Kem spoke about everything. A woman of plain sweaters and blunt sentences, Kem had been her friend since graduate school, and stood at the opposite moral compass point from her polished acquaintances. "You're letting a lot of things go," Kem said over takeout on her sofa, the cedar scent prickling between them. "People who are good for you don't keep you guessing about whether they'll come back." Emma smiled and tucked her palm against the warm curve of a teacup and said, "He buys me keys," which, in a foolish and private registry, felt enough. Her mother, who adored the way small things still fit inside a daughter's heart, gave other counsel. Over the phone, she moved between tender admonitions and a practical litany of maternal numbers. Plumbers, estate attorneys, friends who might drop by. "Trust can't be a stunt," her mother said once, the distance small enough that Emma could hear the thrift store radio in the background. "If you're going to open your life to someone, make the door have a lock with your name on it." It was advice layered with affection and wariness. Emma kept the cedar-scented key in the jewelry drawer and told herself she had done what needed doing. The house tolerated them both, the mother and the lover, like a stage that had been taught to fold light in a flattering direction. Mirrors were everywhere by design, a gilt oval in the entry, a tall one in the hall that reflected the stairways, a beveled rectangle over the mantel. "Mirrors were honest," said the decorators, because they reproduced reality. Emma found a new religion in that phrasing, though some nights she woke thinking a mirror had offered back more than she had placed before it. After 3 months, small patterns pressed themselves into the rooms. In the kitchen, a faint breath of something sweet and mineral would sit under the cedar, like a scent that belonged to another season. On the third night he stayed over, she half awoke and noticed the lamp by the terrace blinking once, twice, as if drawing a long breath. When she reached for her phone, the screen was bright and unremarkable. The clock read the correct hour. The battery hummed at 100%. When she tried to record a soft sound she heard, the video captured only a brief wash of white static between frames. She told herself, in the daylight, that these were quirks of old wiring, exhausted bulbs, the city giving itself to weather. But even as she insisted upon reason, she made mental lists, the way a jeweler appraises a string of pearls. One thumb on every bead. If you've ever trusted someone who felt too easy, she thought to herself, you know how it lulls you into delicate compromises. She thought it once out loud, in a voice meant to be casual over brunch at a private club, and a woman at the next table offered a too bright agreement. That's how con men look, she said, and laughed in a way that didn't match the candor. Emma nodded. In the privacy of the car afterward, the rain pulling lace across the windshield, she watched Noah's profile and felt gratitude coil in the ribs like a small animal. He steadies me, she said. She wanted that to be true. What followed could also have been called a series of small betrayals. Noah's presence was adept at smoothing the day's edges. He attended to garden details she had no patience for, tending a box of potted rosemary by the kitchen window. He rearranged a stack of art books so the titles face outward. He called little rituals our things, and Emma felt seen in a way that wasn't an invitation to vulnerability, but a safe architecture in which vulnerability might be rehearsed. There were moments that did not sit right. Once, at a dinner party held in a friend's apartment that smelled of lemon oil and other people's laughter, he excused himself to go to the restroom and never returned. He had been there for barely an hour. He texted her 90 minutes later. Sorry, traffic, on the way home. He had been at a certain distance the rest of the evening, the kind of distance that presented as privacy but had an undertone of staged absence. When she pressed for details later, his face softened to an acceptable regret, and then to a version of cheer that belonged to the room, the same sound he made when he suggested novels she might like. He used the language someone uses when they are practicing affection in front of mirrors. You're scaring yourself, Kem said once, and Emma knew the line was meant to be a check, a gentle tether. She resented its truth. The first time she saw something she could not place, she told herself she had been dreaming. Dreams, she thought, were the mind's way of balancing debts accrued during waking hours. For a week afterward, the images threaded into the bright parts of her day. In them, a coil of something dark lay under the sofa like a rope left to rest. In those dreams, the coil moved on its own, not like muscle, but like an instrument shifting to tune a note. Each time she woke from those afternoons, she would stand at the hall mirror, fingers pressed to the glass, as if she might steady the world by touch. In daylight, reflection returned only what she had become used to. A woman in a pale sweater whose hair had frayed slightly at the ends from a string of late nights. Emma's first deliberate act of watching was born of a small, domestic reason. A missing pair of earrings. She had left them on the vanity the night before. They were gone that morning. She imagined misplacement, then theft, then worse, and ultimately, because lament had its uses, she decided to stay awake and watch. It was not the bravado of an avenger. It was a difficult, necessary inventory check. She sat in the living room with a book she did not look at, the lamp spilling a wedge of warm gold and the cedar wind rolling under the door. She told herself she would only observe, that she would not confront without proof. She told herself 1,000 times to be careful. She wore her hair back and her wrists were bare. The house thinned into sounds, the cotton padding of footsteps in the stairwell that belonged to no one, the shift of a cat in the courtyard outside, the fragile scrape of trash lines. At 1 in the morning the world had the clean, formal edges of an etching. Her phone sat beside her, screen down, a totem of possible evidence. The clock over the mantel read 1:17. Silence wrapped like cloth. He was home. At first there was the simplest of human gestures, the turn of a key in the entry, a muted cough as he hung his coat on the hook. Her breath stuttered like a bird caught behind glass. The house received him without comment. The light through the tall windows did not betray a thing. He moved through the room with the same soft certainty as always, until he settled onto the sofa and propped his feet beneath him. He looked like the photograph she had taken in the first month, an actor in a frame made to flatter him, a man whose jaw was well lit. He was reading, or pretending to read, an article on urban planning. When he stretched, his shirt lifted a fraction and there, under the hem of his sweater, a shadow that was not the shadow of cloth revealed itself. It was a movement, small, deliberate, that did not belong to a human limb. For an instant she thought of a hand slipping from a pocket, a stray scarf left behind a cushion. Then she saw texture where skin had been. a glimmer of something scaled and dark, catching the lamp's light in a way that suggested not merely gloss, but an architecture of overlapping plates. It uncoiled as if eased from a sheath. The length of it lay along the underside of the couch. For a single, terrifying breath she saw how it curved. An elegant, practiced arc that could have been mistaken for rope or a fallen branch. The thing that lay there made no noise. It gathered itself like a sleeping animal. She could not move. The two halves of her mind seemed to be at war. One cataloging, attentive and methodical. The other shrieking without voice. Adrenaline ran along her spine like a live wire. She tried to reach for the phone, to press record, to capture the impossible in the flat light of a file. Her thumb trembled. The device woke to her touch, glowing with the same promising battery life. She hit record and watched the screen promise footage in its neat little red dot. For a beat it filled the rectangle with an image of static, white and pulsing like quick snow. Then the video dissolved into a wash of gray and silence. When it returned, the couch was ordinary and the room plain. She did not call out. Language felt inadequate and too loud. She swallowed, tasting copper. When she realized she was shaking, she put both hands on her knees as if steadying them would steady her whole body. The lamp hummed. The cedar in the air had an almost tender cleanness to it. Outside, rain that had been steady all evening had withdrawn to a thin, polite drizzle. He turned as if in response to some sound that was not a sound, and, within a half-second, his face was the face that had entered days before. Warm, apologetic, finished with kindness. "You look tired," he said, and his smile was the precise slope of a promise fulfilled. "Did you sleep?" The words lifted like a remedy. He reached for the remote and, in the habit of practiced touching, his fingers brushed her thigh. It was the smallest of contacts, and it tethered her, voice to reality. "I got back late," he said softly. "I'm sorry. I should have texted." She believed him long enough to steady. She believed because disbelief would have required action she could not yet take. He bent slightly and reached for a cushion, nothing beneath it. Then laughed, the sound made to soothe. He told her, with an intimacy that felt rehearsed and therefore dangerous, that old houses had noises, that the wiring did odd things. "You get primed to notice everything," he said. And there was that practiced selfishness of one who was used to being paid attention to. "You're scaring yourself." Later he slept with his back to her and the room filled with his even breathing. The tale, if such a word could be allowed, had retreated. For hours she sat in the dark, counting the minutes until dawn, counting the slightest changes in his rhythm, as if a ledger might map the hours. In the morning, he made coffee like the man she had learned to love. Precise, considerate, a ritual performed with the confidence of infallibility. They sat at the kitchen island, sunlight breaking thin through the blinds, and he told a story about a client who had missed a meeting because of construction. When his hands moved to emphasize a point, she watched for the glimmer of scales and found none. He was, in daylight, an architecture of habit and careful expression. He left with a kiss that tasted of mint and everything that seemed ordinary. She watched him go out the door, coat collar up against the wind, and felt a prickle on the back of her neck. She walked through the rooms as if tracing a crime scene for the eyes only she could see. The couch, the coffee table, the gilt mirror over the mantel. They were clean, as if untouched. There was no evidence of any unroomly presence beneath upholstery or in the dark folds of curtains. Cameras fixed in the corners of the living room recorded the same homely domesticity on their little encrypted files. She sat for an hour reviewing footage until the frames blurred into sameness. Each file, each clip, made the improbable truth slip through her fingers like water. She found a button that afternoon in his coat pocket. It was small, round, and not the kind of button any of his shirts had come with. It had an uneven sheen, and, when she brought it closer to the light, she noticed a pattern of concentric ridges like tiny scales pressed in a spiral. It warmed under her thumb as if it had held heat recently. The thread that attached it to nothing frayed like a suggestion of where it had been. She put it in her palm and felt it anchor her to the certainty that something had been there. The button was not proof in the bureaucratic sense. No one would call it evidence at the police station and get an answer that fit into their official world. But it was a thing she could hold, She texted Kem a picture, her thumb hovering before she sent it. The image was grainy, but the pattern registered like a whisper on glass. Kem answered within minutes with a line of plain necessary commands. Keep it safe. Don't let him know. Come over. Her messages to her mother were more fraught. Are you busy? She tried to avoid words that sounded like hysterics. Her mother's reply arrived slow, steady, threaded through the kind of logic only mothers could send. Bring it to me if you can. Don't show all your cards. Emma hid the button in a jewelry box. She moved through the day with the awareness of a person carrying a small, dangerous thing inside a pocket. She cleaned the living room twice, rearranged cushions, opened and closed doors with deliberate slowness, as if air might be a witness to what she had seen. She rehearsed explanations even for possible friends. Misplaced jewelry, no evidence, maybe a trick of the light. Each restraint felt like another stitch in a garment she hoped would protect her from being dismissed. The first time she tried to show someone, she failed in a way that taught her more about the shape of disbelief than any argument ever could. She invited a neighbor, an amiable woman named Lila, who taught Pilates and tasted the city's gossip as if it were a seasoning, to tea. Lila laughed when Emma mentioned the button, and the laugh settled into an almost gentle disbelief. People tell themselves stories, Lila said. You are under a lot of pressure. Maybe you need a break. Lila's day pronounced itself a better-known narrative. Stress, misremembered things, an overworked mind. Even the sympathetic curl of that reply felt like a reprimand. Emma left the teacup on the saucer, and, behind Lila's back, pressed the button into the cushion of a chair, and found, in the act of hiding, a kind of furious tenderness. The phone betrayed her again that night. She placed it in the living room and recorded for 20 minutes while she walked into the kitchen to wash a glass. When she returned and watched the clip, the frames were intact until a point when the footage collapsed into a bloom of white and then returned with a beat where the couch was empty. No scale, no shadow. Nothing to explain the vague indentations she had perceived. She renamed the file slowly in her head. Evidence 1. Evidence 2. The placeholders read like prayers. She archived them in a folder named, privately, Proof. That very night she dreamed of mirrors. In the dream she walked through a corridor of standing glass, and each reflection was a version of herself, altered in small ways. One younger, one older. One with hair like an old friend she had lost. Nearing the end of the corridor she saw, in a mirror she had not noticed before, a movement not her own. Something uncoiling behind her shoulder with the calm grace of a rope laid down. When she woke, the taste of dream silt clung to her mouth. She tried to construct the world into two plausible columns. The thing she saw and the thing everyone accepted. It was a mental map that allowed for both without asking for proof that could not be produced. She could not name it. She could not find a file that would document its existence. The only things she had were memory and a small button that, in certain lights, seemed to breathe. When she confronted Noah with the idea of absence, asking casually, "Did you go out last night?" His face folded into a familiar apology, and then into a practiced bewilderment. "I was here," he said plainly. "Why would I leave without telling you?" The question was not one of innocence so much as a rhetorical device, a way to re-anchor her to the replicable parts of his presence. He suggested they look at the cameras and, with the confident air of someone whose life had been made of tidy narratives, called the footage up on the living room screen. The files he clicked through showed him coming and going at the hours he claimed, a man whose life had been carefully recorded and curated. "See?" he said, and his voice contained relief edged with concern. "Everything's here." She wanted to scream and laugh at the same time. She felt as if she existed in two documents simultaneously, one public, recorded and sanitized, and another private, illegible and warm with fear. The gap between the two grew like a map's tear, revealing something like a seam. Kem suggested rational maneuvers, staying with her, installing new cameras, changing locks. "If he's doing something that strange," Kem said, "you need redundancy. You need multiple devices that can corroborate one another. They can't all fail." Emma agreed, and yet knew the way small evidences could evaporate under daylight. Evidence, she had learned, required not merely proof but the willingness of others to believe what they could not see. She began to keep a small ledger, a habit she had not possessed as a child, but that now felt like a stern and necessary talisman. She wrote times and impressions in a thin notebook with an indigo cover. 1:17 a.m. Movement under couch. 9:42 a.m. No sign. 3:13 p.m. Button found in coat pocket. Each line read like a litany. She took to sleeping with the ledger on the nightstand, a compact book of insomnia. Time stretched, and the city, with its unblinking appetite for novelty, provided distractions she found difficult to accept. Invitations to dinners, gallery openings, and yacht trips arrived as if nothing guilty could ever rest beneath a casual life. She accepted some and refused others. At a charity auction, she walked the room like a woman who had practiced being whole in public. Guests praised the house in a language that skirted intimacy. "You've made it so welcoming," someone said, and Emma smiled because she had to. The inside of her was a room shuttered for repairs. There were odd compliments to her fear. Once, she found a faint scratch along the underside of a dining chair that matched no pattern of expected wear. Another time, a mirror, which had hung for months without complaint, tilted imperceptibly on its hook and reflected the foyer at an angle that showed deep shadow beneath the baseboard. She was careful to note these as if they were a catalogue of minor infractions. When she tried to point them out to Noah, he offered gentle explanations. A house settling, faulty installation, the quirks of antique fixtures. His language convinced others because it was the language of order. "You're seeing things," he would say, when alone with her, and mean it as tenderness. But the sentence landed as accusation. It made her wonder where gentleness ended and subtle erasure began. The first real test of her resolve happened on a rainy Thursday, when she decided not to be solitary in her watching. She invited Kem over under the pretense of a quiet dinner, and toward midnight asked her friend to sit with her in the living room. Kem, who had a practical faith in protocols, came prepared with a small camcorder and a hot coffee. The two women arranged themselves like conspirators, sharing a blanket over knees. It was an odd intimacy she had not had before. Two friends pooling courage against a private dread. They sat and drank and watched the film of ordinary life. The city outside yawned in the language of storms. A clock on the wall marked the minutes with the steadity of a heart. When the house shifted, they felt it as if moved by an animal. The living room light pulsed with an almost sentient patience. At 1:14, the camcorder caught a faint flutter near the base of the sofa. A dark shape revealed itself, moving with a deliberateness that flattened the room into the scale of a pinprick. On the screen, the thing lay coiled. Nothing like a limb, but not wholly a thing that could belong to the furniture. Kem's hand tightened on her coffee cup. She drew in air and her voice came out as a small controlled instrument. "Do you see that?" For a long minute they watched in silence. On the screen, the object uncoiled, a slow and luxuriant gesture that suggested both strength and a patience older than the house. When Emma reached for the recorder to get a closer shot, the screen went to white. It was not the static of a camera out of battery. The lens filled with a soft, intrusive light, as if someone had waved a curtain across it. When the image returned, there was no trace of the coiling thing, and even more cruelly, the couch looked as if nothing had happened at all. The footage jumped from ordinary to blank and back again, without capturing the thing that had been there. Kem's practical face went slack with a frustration that felt like compassion. "That's not right," she said. "That's not right at all." She clicked through the files with a precision that read like a ritual for exorcism. Each file offered nothing. The videos were honest to the point of being antiseptic. "This is recorded," she said, a statement more to remind herself than to inform. "This doesn't make sense." Her hands were steady and inevitably useless. Noah came home the next morning with a calmness that smelled faintly of cedar and something else, mint, and a smile. He walked into the kitchen like a man who had no idea a house could be read against a ledger. He poured coffee and hummed as though he had chosen a tune specifically to make the rooms agreeable. He sat near the window, fingers laced, and at one point, as if to puncture the tension, he reached across the table and took her hand. Emma could have told him what she had seen and watched him while he explained it away. She had rehearsed the confrontation 100 times in whispers. She found herself at a crossroads, one path lined with the necessity of being heard and believed, the other paved in the pragmatism of Mrs. Housekeeper's rules. Keep life functioning. She chose to place the button, small and cool, on the table between them like an argument. He lifted it with a thoughtful gesture and turned it between his fingers. "Where did you find this?" he asked. There was no malice in the question, only something peculiarly trained to render concern as inquiry. His eyes scanned the pattern and, briefly, a look crossed his face that was not quite ignorance and not quite recognition. For a breath, his pupils shifted as if measuring a door he had not tested. Then he replaced the button on the table and smiled that steady, practiced smile. "Threads come loose," he said. "Buttons fall. Houses are messy sometimes." He reached across and brushed her knuckles with the back of his hand, an action designed to flatten alarm. "You listen to your own voice, Jules," he added softly. "You scare yourself." She wanted to take the button back. She wanted to fold it into the ledger. Instead, she watched him set it back with the civility of someone who could make a small thing disappear into ordinary life. It was a small act of erasure. It felt intimate, because it was deliberate. After he left that afternoon for an appointment, he said he would be back in the evening. She sat in the living room and composed herself as a person prepares a case. She wrapped the button in tissue and placed it into a tiny envelope she labeled in her neat hand. She wrote down the times of departures and returns, and she altered the camcorder's angle so that every inch of the base of the sofa was visible. She did not want to be surprised again. She could not afford surprise. When the time came, she sat awake in a way she had not allowed herself before, alert, attentive, a professional of her own fear. She listened for the sounds of feet, the subtle change in air. The house took on the small texture of a trapped animal. When the movement began, it was not dramatic. It had the patience of an instrument being uncoiled. In the glow of the lamp, she saw the same dark length slip from beneath the couch and lay along the floor in a slow, elegant arc. It moved with an economy that suggested repeating performance. Scales caught the light with a sugared glint. They were not the bright wetness of fish, but a matte, complicated luster that implied the architecture of a creature that had evolved to hide beneath patience. She breathed in, and the air filled with the scent of cedar mixed with something else, earth after rain, or perhaps the faint sweetness of an old attic. The room seemed to narrow to the span between herself and the couch, and she felt keen, like someone listening to a single note, until it seemed to contain the whole of the world. She fumbled for the camcorder with hands that refused to steady. The device turned on, the red light blinking, and for a brief moment the image was as clear as the grain of a photograph. Then, cruelly, the footage shifted to white, and the house was empty. She stared and felt the world tilt. Outside, a train screamed into the station and a neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the corridor. Her fingers tightened on the recorder until the plastic felt like bone. When she looked up, the sofa was ordinary. The room was ordinary. There was not even an imprint on the rug where the dark form had lain. Her rational mind could not reconcile the footage's blankness with the memory of the slow uncoiling. She held the camera in her lap and felt, for a heartbeat, as if she were dangling and being observed by something patient and amused. She was not prepared for his return. He came as if he had been present and honest all along, slipping into the house with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to belong to spaces. He leaned against the entryway, collar slightly raised, and called her name in the voice he used for small consolations. "You look like you've seen ghosts," he said lightly, as he crossed the room. His tone was kind, anchored to common sense. "Are you all right?" Her voice, for once, did not betray her. She held up the camcorder, the only crudely functioning device she had left, and asked him to watch the footage. He obliged, patient and curious in a way that made her chest ache. Together they watched the tape through, and the house looked as it always did, settled, geometrical, and unremarkable. Afterward, when she dared to touch him, she found nothing to trace the memory back to. He was warm. He smelled like cedar and mint. He kissed her cheek with a softness that had been honed to disarm. He listened when she spoke, nodding like someone who wanted to help her reconcile doubts with facts. He suggested new bulbs for the lamps, recommended an electrician he knew. He offered to install a new camera, extra angles, redundancy. "We can fix this," he said, and each word released the air of an architect proposing a renovation. She wanted to believe him. She wanted the house to be safe. She also held, against the edge of her palm, the button wrapped in tissue. a small, stubborn thing that did not dissolve under reason. It was proof of a fact that could not be corroborated, which made it both precious and perilous. She would tuck it later into a book she seldom opened, a volume of poetry that smelled like dust and memory, and when she did so, she felt a movement inside herself like someone clearing a path through a forest. The days after were marked by a pattern of reticence and performance. She moved through social rooms with the curated shine of someone who had always known how to wear composure. At a friend's birthday party, she laughed in the right places and held a glass at the correct angle. There was an economy to the way she let conversation sweep over her now. She became a bank that guarded a secret deposit. Even when friends prodded, "Are you okay? You have been distant," she replied with the correct amount of openness. "I suppose some things feel off," she would say, and the line served to reassure and to hold the space closed. But there were moments, small and private, when memory would exact its small punishments. She would encounter a mirror and watch for the betrayals she had learned to look for. Sometimes the glass offered only herself, neatly presented, and sometimes it seemed to flip a fraction of an inch and show an improbable shadow curling low, as though live wire beneath a floorboard. At night she took to locking each door in a ritual. Deadbolt, chain, a piece of furniture she pushed under the knob like a child's talisman. It was a ridiculous, humble set of behaviors that gave her back some sense of agency. In the ledger, she made notes in an architecture of certainty. The list grew dense with small particulars, a script of time and impressions that she could lay out on the table like evidence. She wrote down the hours he had left and returned, the times the lamps blinked, the feelings she could not name. She wrote, too, the things that had kept her steady: Kem's presence, her mother's sensible voice, the button in its envelope. The ledger became a companion, a quiet witness that did not require anyone's belief. One autumn morning, months into the taut chronology of her life, she glimpsed him across a neighbor's barbecue. He stood at the far end of the yard, performing sociability with the ease of someone for whom social life was a practiced instrument. Around him, people smiled. He moved like a man unconcerned with being watched. A child chased a balloon nearby. Heat from a grill shimmered, and the air smelled of charcoal and basil. He turned, as if aware of her attention, and raised a glass in a motion that was at once perfunctory and precise. His smile angled toward nothing and everything at once. For a beat, she felt the familiar coil inside her chest tighten to an animal's small, urgent note. She did not move. The house of which he had been so deftly a part had become, for her, a repository of hazard. She had learned that love could be a form of camouflage, and that kindness wielded with deliberation could be a weapon. She had learned, not without pain, that trust required the same scrutiny she afforded to investments and art purchases. It was a bitter education, but it had taught her, above all, to value her own testimony. That afternoon, as she walked back through the rooms she had come to both worship and suspect, she paused at the hall mirror. For a moment, less than a second, she thought she saw behind her own reflected shoulder a coil of dark material like the shadow of a rope. She closed her eyes and steadied her breath. When she opened them again, the mirror offered only her face. Composed, determined, tired but not undone. She touched the spot where the button lay in the inside pocket of her coat and felt, beneath her palm, the small, unarguable weight of it. She had not yet plotted a confrontation with whatever he had been. She had not decided whether to call the police or to stage a more elaborate vigil. What she knew was narrower and truer. She had seen something impossible, and when the world insisted the impossible had not occurred, she found herself with a choice: to let the idea of him eat at her, or to learn, as quietly and utterly as she could manage, to live with the knowledge of seams. That night she wrote 3 lines in her ledger, and then read them out loud. They were not a plan, they were a vow of sorts. She promised herself to continue watching, to continue recording, to seek redundancy in ways that could not easily be erased. She promised to listen to the daughter her mother had raised, who had once managed a precarious life with clarity and cunning. Above all, she promised not to let others' disbelief become her undoing. When she shut the book, the house hummed with its usual settled life. Outside, the city started to breathe in the dusk. Inside, under the vaulted ceiling, a shadow shifted. Not loudly, not with drama, but with the calm deliberation of something born to patience. She sat very still, the ledger open on her knees, the cedar scent pressing gentle and insistent into the rooms. In the small pocket she had stitched into an old sweater, she kept the button. She kept it because some fragments belong to memory and not to proof, and because sometimes the only sanctuary is the one you build with the elements of your own witness. She went to the precinct the following morning because the ledger had grown teeth. It was a small, tidy act. Dress neatly, take the folder, let the bureaucracy take its shape. The woman at the front desk wore a coat that smelled faintly of gasoline and official patience. The officer who came to the interview looked like someone who had been trained to believe in two things: paperwork and the limits of testimony. He listened with the polite tilt a professional affords an oddity and took notes that read like a translation of her panic into a spreadsheet. Emma placed the button on the desk between them, inside the clear palm of his glove, and watched his face for the cross of recognition she wanted to see. He turned the piece under the light and he said at length, the kind of sentences that dissolve extraordinary things into ordinary categories. They would log it, he'd said. They'd file it. They'd pass it along. He asked practical questions. Dates, times, people present. And then he asked the one that always landed hardest. Had she seen a doctor? A psychiatrist? Had she slept? The question had the varnish of concern. It also was a way of placing a dangerous experience into the boxes his world could hold. She answered firmly, with the ledger beside her, and Kem's text waiting on her phone like a small code, and the officer wrote another line. No physical evidence observed. They ran a cursory set of standard procedures. Someone from forensics agreed to take the button as an exhibit. They photographed it. They wrapped it in a paper envelope that exhaled a bureaucratic certitude. The officer suggested CCTV checks of the street and the building. He left with the same civility that had been Noah's default expression. She realized, as the precinct's door closed behind him, that institutions moved like sediment. They were slow and governed by laws she could not bend with ledger entries and twitching eyelids. Back at the house, her inbox contained two kinds of responses: those that wanted to help and those that wanted to contain. Lila texted a string of gifs, sympathy wrapped in performative lightness. Kem sent a list: thermal camera rental, an app that logged electromagnetic anomalies, a friend who worked night security. Her mother's messages were practical and astringent. If you feel unsafe, come home with me. There was tenderness in the offer, but also a pragmatic insistence that some things demanded removal rather than confrontation. Emma declined her mother's offer with a firmness that surprised both of them. The house was a repository of the evidence of her life. Not simply possessions, but the geometry of the day-to-day that had taught her how to be herself. To leave would be to surrender the ledger's witness to inertia. She could imagine others retrieving his narrative from the angles of her absence. To leave, she suspected, might allow the thing she'd seen to claim custody of the story. She hired someone whose vocation lived between worlds, a private investigator named Ellis, who dressed like a man who had learned the economy of not attracting attention. Ellis said little at first. He absorbed details with a patience that behaved like competence. He took down names, places, previous addresses, and small oddities about Noah's speech. The results were a thin map of erasures, an email address that bounced, a telephone number that forwarded to a voicemail box, a business card for a consultancy with a registered office that solved into a mailbox in a business complex, where the concierge remembered handing over a stack of envelopes, but could not, weeks later, remember for whom. Ellis's report read like the ledger. Lines that pointed to a man who had been careful to sanitize his trace. People leave paper trails, Ellis said one afternoon, standing in the kitchen with a thermos of bad coffee. He left you a button. That's a paper trail. Sometimes the trail makes noise, and sometimes it makes mud. You can't always tell which until you put your shoe in it. He was practical in a way that matched Kem's bluntness, but came with an institutional coldness. Emma liked him because he did not blink at the word coil when she spoke it. Nor did he smile it away. They installed more cameras, angles that captured places the first devices had missed. They bought a cheap analog camcorder from a resale shop, reasoning that if digital files were being compromised, perhaps an older technology would be less susceptible to whatever unusual interference had spoiled their recordings. Kem learned to sit and watch with an intensity that softened into ritual. 2 cups of coffee, a blanket thrown over knees, a book opened and ignored. The 3 of them constructed redundancies with the earnestness of people who had had their categorical worlds altered by a single imperceptible event. The house, in response, behaved like a room with a secret it was reluctant to reveal. Nights knotted into the same patient thread. Emma slept with her ledger on the nightstand and woke with fragments of dream that tasted like cedar dust and wet stone. The mirrors had ceased to be merely reflective. They had become thresholds of attention. Sometimes she would stand in front of one and watch the way light trimmed her cheek and the precise place where shadow pooled like a basin. Once, for a slow breath, the mirror offered a suggestion, a glinted edge behind her, the suggestion of a curve that was not wholly fabric. She did not scream. She catalogued it, wrote it down, and closed the journal. The second vigil was planned with the methodical mind of someone assembling proof. Ellis stayed the first night. He had an old camera in his lap and a habitually skeptical face. Kem arrived with a thermal mapper and a resolve that read like love. They sat in the low light and made ordinary conversation until the house folded itself into the shape of late hours. At 1:14, the small machine on the mantel recorded a flutter, a shift of infrared like a breath in the floorboards. On the thermal screen a line, dark, deliberate, coiled, not wholly aligned with the outline of a human body. The tendency toward the impossible was not a rush, but a long unease, as if the room unraveled a question slowly and refused to answer it. On that night, however, whatever it was uncoiled with an unhurried arrogance that made Ellis put down his camera and sit forward. The creature, she never named it, and the ledger referred to it only obliquely, extended past the couch in a way that let light fall on scales that were not bright so much as they were architectural. They overlapped like roof tiles or the turned pages of a book. There was a silence around them that suggested patience rather than malice. For a moment it seemed to occupy not the room but the idea of the room, as if it were a punctuation in the ordinary sentence of domestic life. Emma felt every minute extend into a note she could not stop hearing. She moved to stand, then faltered, then reached for the analog camcorder. This time it warmed in her hands like something older, mechanical and honest. She filmed with the hope of a child who believes images cannot lie. The tape whirred, and for a second she had a precise, trembling image. A length. The curve of a tail. The section where a pattern of scales caught the lamplight and turned it into an event. She held the image like a talisman. Then the camcorder clicked, and the tape snapped into a blankness that was not precisely white, but more like the inside of a bell. Hollow and echoing. When the picture resumed, the couch lay ordinary, and the air behaved as if nothing had happened. She found herself holding a camera that stuttered like a witness who had been asked to forget. Adrenaline had an economy of its own. Emma did not wait for reason to recalculate. She ran. She ran through the house with a fierce animal direction, past the mirror, the gilt oval flashing a sliver of her face as she passed. She opened the door and the night bit at her cheeks. Ellis was at the back, breathless and shabby in a way that was honest. They called the police. They called forensics again. They called neighbors. They called anyone who would come and turn the light into a ledger. The arrival of officers was antiseptic and resolute. They moved through the space with flashlights, and the thin authority of people who carry the power to declare evidence valid. For a long hour they walked the rooms and measured the seams of the cushions, and pulled every cushion to check for residue. The cameras produced only footage showing a quiet house. The analog tape, safe in its plastic case, produced no image inconsistent with the ordinary. The blank that had swallowed the image remained nothing a lab could analyze. "Sometimes cameras simply fail," said a man in a suit from forensics who had the expression of someone excused from metaphors. "Sometimes tapes are old, degraded. The eye is more attentive in the moment than a machine is after the fact." His words were soft and meant to comfort. They also erased a part of her ledger. No fingerprints, no fibers, no biological residue. The chair was intact. The cushions did not betray indentations that might confirm the thing's shape. Emma sat on the stairs with the weight of a small, resigned animal, scribbling time into her book. Afterwards, there was the kind of lull that followed a storm. She moved through the days like someone carrying a wound that refused to bleed in public. Her social life thinned in the way a cloth does when invisible moths take to eating its threads. Invitations arrived and she accepted some, refused others. Some nights she let herself be seen, to perform the function she had been trained for: polished, interesting, slightly aloof. Other times she refused to leave the house, which had become both a trap and a sanctuary. In the months that followed, the city offered its bland obliviousness. People who had once praised the house's charm now complimented her on her calendar, on the worthy causes she supported, and on the way she managed to make grief look like quiet competence. She collected small kindnesses like instruments: a friend who brought over dinner, a neighbor who offered to water the plants. Her mother called more frequently, and their conversations turned into the domestic logistics of care. Kem remained steadfast. She became the person who engineered Emma's safety in small practical ways: a second set of keys tucked away, a nightly check-in text, a plan for what Emma would do should she ever find herself needing rapid exit. Kem's voice, direct and unsentimental, replaced the tremor of public doubt with the steel of a plan. "You are not wrong," she would tell Emma, not as consolation, but as statement. "Wrongness is not a social contagion. This is about your life and your house." Emma's mother, whose presence had been more background noise than decisive, came for longer visits. She had a way of moving through the rooms with a categorical tenderness, rearranging a rug, restocking a medicine cabinet, reminding Emma to eat. There were times when Emma resented the practical care, as if it was an attempt to tidy fear into a corner. And yet those small interventions were a bridge. Her mother suggested new locks. She installed a security panel that required codes, layered like a secular liturgy. At night, when the house hummed, she would sit with Emma by the kitchen window and point out the constellations she had learned as a child, as if the named lights above them might offer a grammar for uncertain things on the ground. The media got wind of the tale in the manner of cities. There was a rumor of a woman who had been in love and had seen something impossible. Then the rumor became a headline. Then a softer human interest piece that painted her as courageous or fragile depending on the columnist's temperament. None of it asked the right questions. Reporters asked for photographs and for a neat arc. They wanted a before and after shot and a paragraph that made sense. Emma closed the notebooks to calls that smoothed things into a narrative she did not want to be forced into. The ledger remained a private scripture. There were other small signs that the ordinary world resisted her memory. Noah's social presence, where visible, was an instrument of ease. He cultivated acquaintances with the efficiency of a man at ease in rooms that required little work. He smiled at neighbors, made small talk with concierges, complimented hosts on their art. He had a way of performing presence that made absence look like privacy. In this way, he continued to be an architecture of charm, and charm proved to be a very useful shield. Once, months after she had first seen the thing uncoil, Emma encountered him at an event held in a gallery that smelled of oil and old varnish. He crossed the room like a demonstration of social ease, his hair tidy, his hand extended to the host in practiced warmth. He did not see her approach him as if space had given them a script. When she stood before him, his smile had the cool alchemy of someone who had never once been accused of wrong. He said her name as if tasting it for the first time that evening. For a moment, the old coil of grief tightened in her chest. She considered calling out the ledger, to unfurl the book between them, and ask the witnesses to read. She imagined, for a flash, an upright fury that would make him cough and then confess. The fantasy was raw and juvenile, but clean in its moral line. She also knew the law of public spectacles. They tend to dissolve complexities into spectacle. Her ledger's entries, her camera failures, her button wrapped in tissue would likely be smoothed into gossip. The thing would be declared phantom, or worse, a symptom. She could have made a scene. Instead, she felt the old, learned patience rise in her, not as cowardice but as armor. She let her mouth form the practiced smile she had worn to parties and said nothing. He bowed slightly, the old performance practiced like a dance. She lifted a hand in the smallest possible acknowledgement, and walked away through the crowd as if crossing a threshold to another life. The motion was small, but decisive. It was a refusal. She had once believed that engagement might offer resolution. She now believed that survival could be quieter, an unpremeditated refusal to supply fuel to an impression. Years folded into a kind of careful continuum. Her life did not return to the exactness it had known before. There was an extra seam now that she checked with a corner of her eye. She still kept the button in the secret pocket of the sweater, but its presence had lost a certain hysterical urgency, and taken on the patient dignity of an object that had served its purpose. It had been proof that she would not entirely dissolve into bystanders' consent. She continued, in ways that surprised her, to accept invitations. She continued to employ charm as a currency, because that was how she had always managed the ledger of attention. But she did so with the new calculation of someone who had learned the difference between being dazzled and being bled. Dreams persisted. Images that revisited the corridor of mirrors and the soft architecture of scales. But they had less power to unbalance her. They became instead the raw material of a deeper alert. She learned to watch herself watch, and that reflex, odd and difficult, steadied her more surely than any police report might have. Where once she had searched for corroboration in others' eyes, she now measured her reality against the ledger, and the small, precise responses she had rehearsed with Kem. There was a kind of dignity in the ongoing work of acknowledging a wound without demanding its public exorcism. On a late summer afternoon, in a courtyard trimmed with rosemary and the smell of grilling meat, similar to the barbecues that had once been the careless setting of charm, she saw him again. He was farther from her than at the gallery, a man engaged in easy conversation, his laugh calibrated to the speakers around him. He turned as if to greet someone and, in that half-beat, their eyes met. He recognized her. He raised a glass as if in civility. The world around them continued its small domestic joys. A child toppled, laughing, and hands came up to steady him. The coil of memory in Emma's throat tightened for a moment like a reflex. Then, without drama, she inclined her head and continued walking. It was not a triumph so much as a decision, and in it there was a freedom she had not anticipated. She had lived for months like a sentinel, with the ledger as her map and the house as her terrain. Now, by the simple act of refusal, she reclaimed a piece of ordinary time. The choice was both small and irreversible. She would not let herself be drawn into the theater of proving what could not be pinned without shattering the quiet parts of life. She would let the absence occupy its ambiguous place, and she would, in the meanwhile, arrange the furniture of her life around it. Still, the world retained its seams. Sometimes mirrors offered brief betrayals. Once, on waking, she found a faint, mud-like circumference at the edge of the terrace where herbs grew, a residue-like shadow pressed into the concrete. By the time she found a scraper and a rag, it had faded into nothing, leaving behind only the sense that something curious had occurred. She did not report it. She catalogued it in the ledger, between lines that listed people she trusted and the nights when cameras simply decided to fail. On a small anniversary of a night forever folded in memory, she never celebrated it, but she allowed herself a private recollection. She took the ledger down, opened its indigo cover, and read the first entries she had written in the reactionary grip of fear. Those first accounts were raw and jagged and filled with the small capital letters of crisis, but later pages had smoothed. The handwriting, at first hurried and angular, had become measured. She had learned to transcribe panic into sentences, sentences into plans, plans into small civilities. In doing so, she had built something like a life that could carry the shape of what she had seen without collapsing under it. She kept living among people who had not seen what she had seen, and who often could not understand why she carried the neat old sweater with the small secret pocket. They loved her in the ways they could, with invitations, with calls, with the small jealousies of friendship. She accepted that love gratefully and with guarded reserve. Friends became allies in practical ways. Kem remained a constant presence, someone who would sit in the dark beside her, not to witness the impossible, but to make sure she had someone to hand her a sweater if the night took hold. What remained most surprising to Emma was how trust shifted in her world. It did not evaporate, it altered its shape. She learned to trust herself in a deeper register, an attentiveness to the seams of sentences and the spaces in people's conversation. She learned to distinguish charm, as comfort from charm, as camouflage. She still went out. She still let herself be seen. But she watched for the small repetitions. The way someone smoothed a sleeve where their hands should have been busy. The precise currency of apologies that arrived like rehearsed songs. She catalogued them in her head the way she once catalogued art, by lines and angles and the way light fell on the surface. Years later, if anyone asked the woman who had once been noticed for her place settings and her poise, what it had been like to love something that had been not what it seemed, she would have answered without bitterness. She would have said that love could be a kind of camouflage, and that charm could be a practiced instrument. She would have said, quietly, that the absence of proof did not mean the absence of experience. It simply meant that some things were designed to fold themselves away when watched. In the final ledger entry she kept near the back of the indigo notebook, she wrote not a plan, but a statement. It was purposed like a promise. She wrote, "I will be my own witness." The sentence was small and steady. She added a line beneath it. "Trust is measured, not abandoned." She pressed the pencil down and closed the book. The house, perfumed with cedar and the memory of evenings, received the gesture with a familiar hush. Outside, the city's lights stitched themselves into an indifferent constellatory map. Inside, mirrors reflected ordinary faces, and in the spaces between reflections, she kept the memory of a coil that had once uncoiled beneath a couch and retreated like a tide. She had been a socialite who had loved with the veracity of someone who had been suddenly given an estate. She had become, after horror and the prosaic failure of instruments, someone who could hold a contradiction and keep moving forward. The lesson, she understood, was not a moral but an apprenticeship. To believe one's senses without demanding that the world recompose itself around that belief. To trust oneself when others could not be persuaded. To measure attentiveness as one measures valuables. Carefully, with an eye for detail, and with the humility that some things will remain unknowable. If this unsettled you, subscribe for more stories like this one.